Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast, where we are joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to unpack why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. I'm Robert Ward, the IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geo-economics and Strategy.
And I'm Yuka Koshino, Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy. Today, we are very grateful to be joined by Murakami Yumiko-san, General Partner at MPower Partners and former head of the OECD Tokyo Centre. Yumiko-san has a vast wealth of experience in both international organizations and the private sector, as well as experience advising the Japanese government in various councils, including those in the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to the OECD, she worked as a management director for Goldman Sachs in New York and London for 20 years. She was also involved in UN peacekeeping forces in Cambodia and economic development assistance work in East Caribbean. Yumiko-san is also the author of the book Buki toshite no Jinkougen Shakai, titled Turning Demographic Challenges into Economic Opportunities in English. Her book is a bestseller in the Amazon Economic Books category. She's also a graduate of Sophia University in Tokyo and received a master's degree in international relations from Stanford and MBA from Harvard. Yumiko-san, we are delighted to have you today.
Yumiko-san, if I may start with drawing upon your very broad range of international expertise, just to set Japan in the regional context. So I know US competition is intensifying. There's particularly a focus on economic security within that competition. And within that, there's a focus, obviously, on decoupling, de-risking of supply chains, and so on. Japan's been such a major investor in Asia for many, many years now, and is really embedded economically in China as well. So how do you think that Japanese companies are responding to the current regional geo-economic environment?
Thank you for the question. I wish I could just say, here's the answer. No one knows the answer. It's a very difficult situation that Japanese companies are facing. It's sort of being caught in a crossfire between the most important trading partners for Japan. So US accounting for 15% or so of the Japan's trading value, and China 20, I believe 3 or 4%. So both are extremely important trading partners for Japan. Japanese companies are literally caught in the crossfire. But it's not the unique situation for Japan. Many other European countries, for example, they are in a similar situation. But I do think Japan has a very unique positioning, located so close to so many important other markets in Asia. So that gives you a different dynamics in terms of what Japan can do in terms of the turning this crisis or a very difficult situation into potentially opportunity. What I mean by that is that Japan can be extremely important for both US and China. And Japan is in a very unique situation to play both. Semiconductor, for example, that's actually a really interesting way to look at how dynamics are changing. Japan still deals with China in terms of trading volume. If you look at the 2021, this year, trading volume, Japan still trades with US and China mainly, but China in particular, semiconductor equipment, that's number one of the biggest products export to China. So what does that mean? It's critical. As you probably know, that's the pain point for a lot of industries, very important industries. A lot of technology companies are basically suffering from the shortage, extremely severe shortage of semiconductor products, not only in China, but also in the US as well. So Japan is actually in a really interesting situation because they are the one who is providing extremely critically important part of the trading volume for China. The other interesting thing is there is a lot of talk in terms of how Japan is trying to entice investments into Japan to open new plants, especially from Taiwan. So that's another interesting angle. As you know, the supply chain, especially when it comes to semiconductor, that is becoming a very politicized issue here. U.S. is really building up their capacity in terms of semiconductor production capacity. China is suffering from the fact that they are still lagging behind when it comes to production of semiconductors. Taiwan, as you know, has really emerged as the most important player in that space. Where does Japan fit? it fits in sort of a middle way. It's still an important player in terms of production capability, but they don't have the kind of volume it used to have. But they still have very high level of R&D. They still have very high level of users. So if you talk about Toyota of the world, if you talk about Sony of the world, they are Japanese companies. It makes a lot of sense for Japan to try to get investments from Taiwan to expand the semiconductor production capability within the Japanese territory to enhance the supply chain for semiconductor, not only for Japan, but also perhaps for the US because of the alliance between US and Japan. So again, that gives Japan a lot of interesting sort of leverage, so to speak, which wasn't that clear up until this point. Up until this point, meaning until now, we see this very severe decoupling situation. And I do think the fact that Japan can potentially play, I don't want to call it game, but it is a really game, sort of interesting balance of power to their advantage. I think it's an interesting situation. I mean, it's a difficult situation, right? In terms of decoupling, it's affecting a lot of countries, many countries in Europe, many countries in Asia, including Japan. But because of where Japan is relative to other countries, I do think Japan actually can see this as an opportunity.
The government's been talking about strategic indispensability, trying to create a sort of niche for Japan in the sense of being sort of indispensable in certain areas. Do you think there's a sort of niche for Japan in semiconductors in this sort of strategic indispensability vision?
I think it can be one of them. I don't think semiconductor itself, in terms of production capability, can be such a huge advantage, I would say. But the fact that Japan can really use that link to strengthen the entire supply chain, not just for a supply chain of semiconductor, but the supply chain for other products. You know, we're talking about literally cars, we're talking about Sony, we're talking about many other related industries. And Japan does have a very strong capability when it comes to, for example, batteries. You would think batteries as a standalone product, they may not be all that exciting. But if you look at battery as a part of this huge supply chain, it can be all of a sudden very interesting part of the Japan's offerings. So if you combine that with the fact that Japan may be in a position to really ramp up and start producing more semiconductor at the high end, because there, as you know, there are a very wide range of semiconductor products, right? So we're talking about the very high end of the semiconductor products, which can be executed perhaps more easily in Japan versus other countries. And I do think that can be potentially Japan's so-called edge. So not a standalone in terms of semiconductor production capability, but because it can be embedded in a much bigger framework in terms of other industries, that is Japan's edge. And hopefully this is giving Japan an opportunity to play that card, and hopefully Japan can actually really do well.
Back to decoupling briefly. Last year, the government provided some subsidies for companies to relocate production out of China, perhaps into Southeast Asia, perhaps back into Japan. But it doesn't seem to have been, I think the take-up has not been that good with regard to this. What do you think is going through Japanese companies' minds as they're making the decisions about where to keep their production?
It's an interesting trend, as you said, diversification from China to other parts of Asia in terms of, manufacturing capabilities. Look at Apple, for example, right? Not only Japan, but for example, Apple, developed by Apple in California, assembled in China, that whole approach, i.e. R&D in the US and the supply chain in China or Asia. The reality is, if you look at the new plants that have been built in Vietnam for Apple, many of them are actually owned by China. So even though at the sort of on a superficial level, you may think, oh yeah, there is a lot of diversification going on, not only with Japanese companies, but Apple of the world. But the reality is China still has a very, very dominant space in many of these large countries or companies' supply chain systems. For political reasons, yes, Japan actually has decided to push forward diversification process. But the reality is it is not moving as quickly as you might think. And I do think that's the case for many other countries. It's not just unique for Japan. So what Japan can do is the fact that Japan is very close to many other Asian markets, closer to these Asian markets than, say, the US is. US is, quite frankly, in my opinion, is having a little bit of an issue in terms of how they should be working with Asian countries. They're trying. You can see how they're trying, but they don't have the greatest track record, right? When it comes to, especially in the last several years, when it comes to working with Asian countries or in general in the multinational, multilateral trading frameworks. They are not probably the best country to sort of set the tone or sort of lead a collaboration. But Japan is, or Japan is at least better or better positioned to lead regional, if not global, multilateral trading framework. Certainly for Asia, Japan can play, or Japan has been playing a much of a leading role. RCEP, for example, Japan actually really has led that RCEP discussion. If you look at TPP, even it became 11, not 12, Japan still really pushed through the whole process. So Japan does have a track record of having a very strong credibility when it comes to working with many other Asian countries. So I do think that, yes, Japan actually really officially pushed this whole diversification move. In reality, it really has not happened as quickly or as aggressively as people might think. The reality is, I think we are still living in this multilateral trading framework. It may not be working all that perfectly. Now that Japan has established a sort of track record for both TPP and both RCEP, now, as you probably know, there is a new alliance promoted by US, Australia, Japan, and India. As you probably know, that's another one. That's very clear, right? The intention is very clear. It's just trying to make sure that there is an alliance that doesn't have Chinese influence. Japan is still in that quad. It's still one of the four. It's an interesting time for Japan. This is the whole decoupling, and it's a hard situation for many countries, but I will look at it as opportunity for Japanese government and Japanese business players.
Your comments sort of lead us nicely to my next question, actually, which is around the CPTPP. And as you've been saying, Japan played a really important key role in keeping CPTPP on track after US withdrawal. As we all know, China has put an application in to join. And Taiwan as well. And as you said, Yumiko-san, absolutely rightly, it's a really interesting time for Japan. How does Japan manage this, particularly on the CPTPP, with the sort of geopolitics encroaching quite quickly, particularly over the last week or so?
Again, I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. It's a it's a very challenging situation. One of the key elements is obviously the data issue, right? How do we look at the whole data trust issue? Japan has an interesting almost edge. If you look at what Japan did 2 years ago at G20, they're spearheading this whole idea of data free flow with trust. Again, it's a very challenging situation in terms of having everybody on board. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but the idea is for Japan to establish a strong enough framework in which countries can really take advantage of the new data-driven economy. Actually, is going to be one of the most important elements if you're talking about trade or any economic issues, whether trade has a very strong element of data usage. Japan really try to come up with a framework which reflects some of the very strong regulation elements. Many of them are coming from the EU, for example, but at the same time, China has a very different concept when it comes to data regulations. So Japan tried to come up with something that can be seen as strong enough framework in terms of having a very high level of safety. At the same time, strong enough, but it's not so inflexible that it's going to prevent companies or countries from having a very strong data elements in their business development. So again, this is 2 years ago. And again, this is G20 when Japan was chairing G20 and I was part of the OECD team working for the G20 meetings. And I remember this was really one of the biggest things that Japan really tried to push forward. So 2 years later today, basically, a similar issue has come up. When it comes to data, a concept is completely different. What China has in their head and what we have in our head in Japan and what the European guys, you guys have very different sort of, approach, and the US has very different approach. So I do think Japan can, again, become, I don't want to say go between, because at the end of the day, there is no way that Japan should compromise in terms of the level of protection, level of safeguarding. But at the same time, they can be the bridge in terms of making sure people have the share the same understanding in terms of what needs to be done. And I don't think it's going to be very easy. It's a relatively new sort of development, right? What we're seeing with China. If anyone is going to do it, I think Japan is the one that can potentially broker in terms of filling the gap between these two different worlds here in terms of how they look at data.
You rightly say, Yumiko-san, data free flow with trust, really important for the whole liberal international order, actually, particularly given China's data sovereignty push, Russia as well, others too, so important development. Global standards and rule setting are also now an important area of geopolitical competition, particularly as China also now sees itself as a rule setter and has aspirations to set rules, particularly in the world of data and cyber. What role do you think that Japanese companies can play in setting international standards?
I think that's one thing that I would love to see more of. In terms of the voices I can hear from the private sector, the Japanese companies that can be more visible or can really push forward some of the very important agenda items such as data free flow with trust. They're not as visible as they should be. If you look at the level of infrastructure or the level of technologies that many of these Japanese companies own, they have ability to be an opinion leader. I don't think they're doing that as much as they should. So again, Japan has a very unique situation right now, being in the region, in Asia, being so close to China, being so close to the rest of Asia, being dominant player in the Southeast Asia business markets. Japanese companies, if they do speak up, there are enough people who want to listen to them. That's one area where I would love to see more of. Again, I came from OECD, just left a couple months ago. At OECD, of course, we do a lot of international conferences and many discussions. And I always felt as if Japan, or especially Japanese companies from the Japanese private sector, they could be more visible just because they have so much to offer, just because their history with China, history with the US, history with Southeast Asia on the business front, they should be a lot more visible, or they should be playing more leadership role. One belt, one road, obviously. Japan has been competing China by promoting quality infrastructure approach, which takes into consideration a very wide range of factors when making investment decisions, such as environmental impact or social impact or debt sustainability. Those are the things that are normally important for a Japanese project versus Chinese project, right? But what's interesting is Japan has taken the view that they can work with China. So the way the Japanese government or Japanese even companies have been looking at the whole picture in terms of, one belt, one road versus, high quality infrastructure approach is that, hey, we can work with China. We can actually work with them and let them see how we do it. Let them see, what kind of benefits Chinese companies or Chinese government can really gain by doing the way we do it. So that's the approach. So they've been very cordial. They've been very supportive of each other between Japanese and Chinese. And I think that's an interesting way to approach political tension that we're seeing in this region, around the world, really, but especially in Asia. So that's what I would love to see more of. From Japanese companies, when they work with China, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be enemies. And they have taken a really good approach. I see this approach as a very good example for the U.S. as well, and a good example for Japanese companies and other companies in terms of how they can set the high level, high standard, and let them see how they conduct themselves in terms of, executing these projects.
Inclusiveness is really the key for Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific foreign policy, but also its policy approaches to shape the digital rules making, as you mentioned. We talked a lot about the role of Japanese businesses and Japan's potentials in Asia. We're very interested in hearing more about the role of Japan's startup in all this discussions. And this year, you launched the ESG-focused venture capital fund, MPower Partners, with Kathy Matsui and Miwa Seki. Could you please tell us why you decided to set up this fund?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I'm Japanese. I was born and raised in Japan. I went to the U.S. for graduate studies, and I basically ended up staying in the U.S. almost all my adult life. So when I came back to Japan, which was about 11, 12 years ago, I felt as if Japan had so much to offer. There's so many good things going on, in this country. number one, food is great. I mean, I love Japanese food here. Restaurants are great. But, it's safe, and, there are a bunch of things that are going really amazingly well in this country, especially somebody like me who spent half my life in the US. I love the US, by the way, but I see, at the same time, a lot of social problems. And, I started to think, so why is it Japan has so much to offer? It's such a great country in terms of the quality of people, in terms of educational levels, in terms of, technology, social infrastructure. But why does Japan have such a low productivity? Why is it that Japanese companies are not that profitable? The growth rate is, one of the lowest among the OECD countries. And I realized that it is at least partially because not many young companies can grow in this country. I spent 7.5 years with OECD looking at a bunch of sort of international comparable data sets. And there's so many good things going on for Japan. But I realized that these dots are not connected. Given my experience in the financial industry, I thought, okay, maybe I should combine financial industry experience and this desire to kickstart this whole startup scene, like pushing them to do something about this sort of, slow growth situation that Japan has been in for the last basically 20 years. So I spoke to my friends, Kathy Matsui and Miwa Seki. They are my partners, three of us. We have been in financial industry for, a long time, 20 some years. Kathy and I actually started together at Goldman Sachs in the same year. She started in Tokyo, I started in New York, but we worked as, colleagues for a long time. Miwa Seki was 1 year ahead of me at business school. So that's how we met again 20 some years ago. She also spent quite a few years with Morgan Stanley, and then she became a portfolio manager of Japanese equity portfolio for a US asset management company. So we all have had very long investment industry experience. We also had very unique experience as a minority, as a woman in the Japanese context. And we also felt as if, hey, Japan has so much to offer, but what is it that's lacking? Because we don't see a lot of growth. So we share the same sort of sense of almost crisis, because we love Japan. We are from Japan. We see a lot of really good potentials, but something is missing. Sort of slow death that Japan is going through. Perhaps one of the most impactful things that someone like me or we can do is to set up a fund and invest in startup companies. Japan is flooded with cash, but not much risk money. So we figured, okay, if we provide risk money, because we have great people, because we have great technologies, maybe things would change. So that's what we are trying to do. Relative to the GDP in Japan, the so-called risk money or investments into startups or basically private companies before they go public, Japan is 1/35 of the United States. Compared to China, it's like 1/16 or something like that. Some crazy. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. Yet money is everywhere. Japanese companies are sitting on this huge amount of cash. So the money is not an issue. Risk money is an issue. So hopefully we can trigger the movement that can hopefully lead to growth of Japanese economy. We think that we can do so by focusing on companies that can scale to the global level by integrating ESG. If you look at the ESG investment trend, Japan is starting to catch up with the rest of the world, but it's still kind of relatively new concept. We do think that ESG is not just sort of nice thing to say, but the ESG elements are the elements that can make companies more sustainable and more competitive and really can help them grow on a global level. So we're combining the ESG elements with this investment fund that we just launched. And hopefully you're right. It's still new, right? It's been only 4 months or so since we launched the fund. The target is 150. We're not disclosing the amount of capital we have raised. I can say we have received extremely strong support from investors. So it makes me feel really good about what people are really looking for. I think, especially large institutions, large financial institutions in Japan, they really know what they need to do. And I do think, when I say there's no risk money, they know that's what they need to do. But it's easy to say, hard to do. So when we went to them and, hey, this is the concept, they were very supportive. And I think it goes to show you how at least the sense of crisis is there, the awareness is there. And I think we give them more options in terms of deploying capital or risk capital into this segment. I think there will be even more risk money going forward for Japan.
Very interesting. And again, we're very grateful to have the first co-founder of the first female-led venture capital fund as our first Japanese private sector guest in our podcast. Creating vibrant startup ecosystem was maybe not the major, but one of the elements, I think, under the growth strategy in Abenomics. But do you think this was successful, or what more do you think needs to happen in the future Japanese governments?
In terms of the, growth strategies that Abe administration try to execute, you probably know 3 arrows, right? So everyone said first arrow, fine, second arrow, fine. The third arrow was the one that really go that far. And that third arrow, which is basically structural reform, as far as I'm concerned, that was the most important arrow, but unfortunately it really has not been executed as well as I was hoping to, and I'm sure people are disappointed as well. That is also part of the fact that explains the labor market is still very rigid because the structural reform was really not executed in a full. When the labor market is rigid, when the mobility within the Japanese labor market is not that great, it's hard for startups to recruit young talents. It's hard for growing companies to recruit, very high level talents. Same thing for Japanese traditional companies as well. One of the most important elements was the fact that labor market had to be restructured or had to be really destroyed and renewed. I see a change. I see some Japanese companies are changing in terms of the way they manage their employees, and their recruiting practices are starting to change. But if you look at the macro picture, it's still very rigid. And that makes it hard for people to move around. That makes it hard for new companies to hire high-level talent. I hope that would change.
Another aspect of Abenomics was to promote more female in the workforce, and I'm sure you have been very active on this, and your colleagues as well, who also coined the term womenomics. Do you think this has been successful so far, or what more would you like to see on this aspect as well?
Yes, of course, it's one of the most important aspects. In fact, it is a very low-hanging fruit for Japan. I can tell you one of the OECD surveys that I always mention is the adult skill survey. We look at adult population 16 to 65 and sort of look at the basic skill levels for literacy and numeracy. So can you read and write, and can you do math? And Japan comes at the top. Japanese women comes at the top. It's not like we have to start sending women back to school. It's not like we have to retrain them. The level, skill levels, again, numeracy and literacy, already at the top level, Japanese women. Yet OECD's data shows gender wage gap is one of the largest in Japan, so it's 26% between men and women. When women, Japanese women, at the top level in terms of skill levels, they suffer from the largest wage gaps. Women are already well educated, well skilled. So if you were to place them in leadership roles in the same way as men are today, if you were to narrow or eliminate the gap in terms of compensation, promotion opportunities, then what would happen? The Japanese long-term GDP growth, potential would double. Instead of 1%, it would be almost 2%. And it's not secret. A lot of people have already done this, this sort of scenario analysis. We have done it at OECD. No, I shouldn't say we, because I left OECD. But my colleagues at OECD have run the scenario, and the GDP of Japanese economy is double 20 years if you address that 26% wage gap. Same studies have been done by the Japanese government and IMF and World Bank, and they all come up with the same conclusion. So that's an opportunity, and Japan has so much to offer in terms of addressing that issue. Abe administration has done a really good job sort of promoting women to work. If you look at the female labor market participation rate, Abe administration has done an amazing job pushing that ratio to one of the top ratio. Now it's higher than that of the U.S. So I don't think it's a huge problem in terms of women working. The problem is the fact that a lot of women are working, but not in leadership positions or executive positions, and therefore the wage gap still remains very large.
How close do you think Japan is to having a female prime minister?
Well, we had 2 out of 4 candidates, women, right? So that's actually a very good start unfortunately, or I guess it was expected that we have a male, but hopefully he will do a good job. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, to be honest with you. The new prime minister, Kishida-san, and also they have seen what has happened in terms of how Japan has been failing in terms of gender diversity scorecard and how that has hurt Japan. And I hope that they realize that this is, again, a very low-hanging fruit. If you look at the World Economic Forum gender index, you probably know Japan has been slipping even through the Abe administration time when he was really pushing this whole diversity agenda. One of the biggest reasons why that has happened is the fact that on the political front, you don't see a lot of women in the cabinet. Hopefully, the new prime minister and other leaders, they have learned a lesson that they need to start with their own cabinet. And I don't have no idea how many women are going to be selected. But hopefully they will address that. The society is a reflection of the government. Hopefully Keidanren and other business leaders see they're doing it. We got to do it too.
Before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, she was asked, would there be a female Prime Minister in the United Kingdom? And I think she said probably not in her lifetime. And then, of course, she became the first.
Thank you very much for your fascinating insights. So we would like to end with our Japan Memo questions. Do you have any book recommendations for listeners who wish to understand about Japan?
I don't have a book recommendation. Nowadays, a lot of the reading that we used to do has been replaced by podcast. So I have a recommendation for podcast. It's entitled Japan Capitalism That Works. It's a podcast by Jasper Koll. Koll. It's fascinating. It's a series. But what I just talked about in terms of startups, here's a very interesting perspective, what Japan can do to take advantage of this very difficult situation and then perhaps turn this into much more interesting opportunity, something that I would love people to listen to.
What do you think people often get wrong about Japan?
I think people get wrong about, for example, the Japanese demographic challenge. People tend to think this as a huge negative. And, I'm not saying it is not a negative. It can have a lot of negative impact. It can also offer a very, very attractive upside. Japan is the first country to face it. And guess what? The rest of the world, whether it's China or Korea or US, even US or Europe, the rest of the world, they're going to have the same problem, whether it's going to be 5 years on the road, 10 years on the road, it's different time points in the future, but relatively in the near future. This can be an amazing business opportunity. What Japan can do to address the aging society, it can be exported to China. It can be exported to Europe. My mother was a housewife until 48. She started a drugstore. At the age of 48, she was an entrepreneur. She sold a lot of adult diapers at her drugstore. No one thought adult diapers would be a big hit, but she knew there was going to be a demand because she was taking care of her in-laws who were in the 80s. Now, you probably know in Japan, adult diapers sell much more than baby diapers. So that's just, that's a kind of simple example in terms of how this can be a potentially really interesting business opportunity in terms of what Japan is facing as a result of declining population, as a result of an aging society. China is so big, right next to Japan, and they're going to have the same problem in just a couple of years on the road. That tends to be missed when people look at Japan. Oh, Japanese population declining and aging society. An interesting point that people tend to miss.
I think you're spot on there, Yumiko-san, about the opportunities from the aging population as well. And there are lots of companies in Japan doing really interesting things, sort of servicing the older population. So I think it's a wonderful place to end on. Thank you, Yumiko-san. You've ranged over foreign policy, trade issues, business issues, startup issues, and demography. So we've covered a lot of ground here. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you, listeners, for listening to episode 4 of Japan Memo. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. For more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research by the Japan Chair Programme and the broader IISS on our website.
We also hope to connect with you on Twitter, where we are actively sharing the latest news and analysis on everything Japanese geopolitics and more. You can find us at Robert Allen Ward and at Yuka Koshino. Thank you again, and see you next time.